So the management studio is open on both the servers. This is our 1P server. Let's connect, and we are connected with the SQL instance. So what we are going to do is we are going to create one SQL authenticated ID with sysadmin access. So once we add this server in the domain, we have some ID to access the instance, and we can use this instance. So let's call it as AWS AON SQL. This is a SQL authenticated ID. Let's give some password, and user must change on first login. I have removed this option and make it as a sysadmin. Okay, and let's do the same thing on 1S instance as well. So on 1S instance, management studio is opened. Now let's connect. Now create the SQL authenticated ID. AWS SQL. As a sysadmin access. Okay, so now we have access on these SQL instances. Now let's try to join the server into the domain. Now let's start with 1P. So on the 1P instance, go to File Explorer. In the File Explorer, this PC, right click and go to Properties. In the Properties section, you can see the Change Setting option. Click on the Change Setting and click on Change. So from here, you can change the host name of the server. The host name of the server is SQL Server 1P, and the domain is avenger.com. So okay, so before joining this server, we have to cancel this one, and we have to add the DNS server IP in the network. So let's go to the network and settings. So go to Ethernet, change the adapter setting, go to Ethernet 2, properties, and in TCP IPv4 we have to click on properties, use the DNS server. Now let's use our AD server IP address as the DNS server. This is the AD server IP. Copy this AD server IP and paste it over here. And in the properties section, DNS. Let's do this after some time. So one thing that we have to do is use the following DNS server. Click on OK and close and close, close. Now let's add this server into the domain. See, now we have to give our Avenger password, AWS AON, or we can use AVN /AWS. So once the server is added into the domain, it will get restarted. Welcome to avenger.com. Click OK. You must restart your computer to apply the changes. Click OK. Close this Windows. Restart now. Now let's do the same thing for 1S instance as well. Go to the File Explorer, or let's go to the network and settings first, and Ethernet, change adapter option, Ethernet, properties, TCP IPv4 properties, use the DNS server, copy the AD server IP address and paste it over here. So a DNS server for this server will be our AD server. Now close all these things. Go to the file explorer, properties, change settings, change, give the new host name SQL Server 1 as domain is avenger.com. See, so SQL Server 1s is also added into the domain. Let's restart this also. So both the servers are added into the domain. Now let me show you. Now we can see in now I have log in. I am in my domain controller and let's open Active Directory users and computers. It should be already opened actually, but it's not. So let's open from the tools section. Go to Active Directory users and computers. In the Avengers, first go on view and use advanced features. Go to Avengers, and in the Avengers computer section we can see two new computers are added. So now let's try to log in on these two SQL servers using our Avenger ID mstsc. Now we can use our hostname SQL Server 1p. Actually SQL Server 1p dot avenger.com. Now this will not resolve because our jump host is not added onto the domain. So if we add our jump host also into the domain, then we can resolve this from the jump host itself. Or let me add the jump host also into the domain. Just I have to log in on each servers again. So you can get the feel actually that you are in Avenger domain. Change. Let me change the host name also to Jumpbox. Change the setting Ethernets. Properties. TCP IPv4 properties. Use the DNS server. Copy the AD server IP address. Paste it into the DNS server. Click OK. Close and close. Here you have to write change settings and OK. So once the jump host is added into the domain, then we can directly log in using the SQL Server 1p and 1s. Close, restart now. Let it get restarted. Let's wait for some time. So now I have added my domain controller, my jump host into the domain controller. Now let's log in onto the AD server first. So this is the IP of the AD server, 224. Now let's log into the SQL server. SQL server, we can use SQL server 1p. SQL server 1p dot avenger.com. See, it get result. Now AWS AON and password. So see, you can get the feel that now your password is not correct. AWS AON. Okay, so we have logged in onto SQL Server 1p. Now let's do the same thing for SQL Server 1 s.avenger.com. Okay, so we have logged it. We have added all the servers into the domain. So let's go back to our diagram. Now we have created the jump server, we have created the AD server, we have created both the SQL servers, we have added these servers into the domain, and this jump box is also added into the domain. Now the next step is, so first we have to log in on our SQL instances, then we have to configure Windows failover cluster on this. Once the Windows failover cluster is configured, then we have to configure always on this. So we are currently on SQL Server 1s. So okay, so we are currently on SQL Server 1s. Let's minimize it. Let's open SQL Server 1p once. So this is SQL Server 1p. Let's open SQL Server Management Studio on this. Let's see if the shortcut works. No. So SQL Server. Here we are. SQL Management Studio. I have opened SQL Server Management Studio on both the servers. And one more thing we have to do in the networking part. So let's this open in the background. Let's open now. We are on the SQL Server 1p instance. This is also a very important step. Once we add these servers into the domain, go to the Ethernet setting, change Ethernet adapter properties, and we have already added the DNS server, but let's go and add the domain as well. So in the DNS part, let's remove these two domains and add avengers.com. So this is the domain, and let's click on this, use this connection for DNS suffix in the DNS registration. So this is important because when we are configuring the failover cluster, this connection will be used to connect with the failover clusters. So this is done, close and connect. So this will not get connected. First we have to use SQL authenticated ID, and the ID that we have created was AWS AON -SA -SQL actually. we missed one step. So in order to configure this server into the AWS AON or log in via AWS AON, we have to first log in on the server using the administrator. Run as different user, run as administrator. Yes. Let's see if we are able to open it. This will not work. So in order to make this work, we have to open SQL Server Management Studio with the local administrator actually. Right click, run as different user, and then let's use administrator. Caps lock. And let's use our local password as well. Actually, we missed one step while we created the SQL server. While we created the SQL Authenticated ID, we have to enable the SA logins. By default, when we use the AWS AMI to create the SQL instance, see this is connecting with SQL Server Administrator. This will get connected. This should get connected, or we have to log off from this server and then connect via SQL Authenticated ID. Connect via local administrator and then use that local administrator to enable SQL Authenticated ID. Then we will process these steps. So let's see if this fails, if this will fail. And okay, so what we have to do is we have to go on the security parts and enable SQL Server and Windows authentication. Before only Windows authentication was enabled. That's why we were not able to access the instance using SQL authentication. Let's click on OK. And for this actually we have to restart the SQL instance. So we can do it from configuration manager, or I'm doing it directly from the management studio. So once you restart the SQL server, it will ask you to restart the SQL agent services as well. So attempting to start the SQL Server 1P, we have to do the same step on 1S as well. So let's disconnect it, close the SQL Management Studio, and let's connect again with SQL Authenticated ID, which was AWS AON-SQL. And see it got connected. So once we are connected, we can create a new login as Windows Authenticated. So Windows Authenticated ID, and we can grant access to our domain controller ID. The domain controller ID is check name. So this part is done in our on 1P instance. Let's go and do the same thing on 1S instance as well. So on 1S instance, we have already created SQL Server Management Studio. Let's cancel this part as we know this will not work, and let's open different user. administrator, and let's use the password. So this is opening SQL Server Management Studio with the local administrator ID. This is the local administrator ID. Let's use the new name that we have given and click on connect. This is connected. Let's do the same step that we did on the 1P instance. Go on to the security part, enable SQL Authenticated ID, click OK, and then restart the SQL instance. Where is the restart option? Refresh, restart, sorry. Yes. So it's asking us to restart the SQL Server as well as SQL Server agent service. So once this is restarted, then we will be able to connect with our SQL instance with our local administrator ID. Let's close this one and let's try to connect with our SQL authenticated ID which we have created, which is SQL, and the password is return connect. This is connected. Let's create the new login for our domain controller ID. So our domain controller ID has been added, and let's check if we have made the changes in the DNS part. Once that changes are done, go to properties and DNS server, remove these two domains, add avenger.com, add this and use this connection for DNS suffix. Click on OK, OK, close, and close all these things. So now if we go on to our architecture diagram, these are the things that has been done. So these are the things that are done. So now we have created a virtual private cloud, we have created the availability zones, we have created the subnets, we have launched the EC2 instances, and configuration part is done. Now we have to make the connection between these two SQL servers. So the first connection that will be made between these two connection will be, these two SQL server will be configuring a Windows cluster. For configuring an SQL server always on, the required feature is to configure a Windows cluster. Then only we can configure a SQL server always on. So in order to configure Windows failover cluster, we have to install Windows failover cluster on these servers. So in order to install Windows failover cluster on these servers, we have to open Server Manager. Go to the add rules and features. Let's wait for some time. Let's open Server Manager on 1S server as well. So I am configuring both the servers simultaneously, so it will take less time for us. Let's wait for some time till this get populated. Okay, so now we are able to open it. Click on next, next, and in this we have to select Windows failover cluster, failover clustering. Add this feature. Next, and install. Let's do the same thing on 1S instance as well. Next, 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 and Windows failover clustering. Add this feature. Next, and install. So once this is installed, then we have to configure the failover cluster on these servers. So in order to configure a failover cluster on the server, we have to create one failover cluster object in the Active Directory. So this is our Active Directory server, and in the computer parts we have to create one new object which is Windows cluster. For configuring a Windows cluster, we have to create one cluster object that will be AWS AON cluster. Okay, and cluster, click on OK, and we have to grant permission to this AWS cluster. So this AWS cluster should have full permission on both the computer objects, that is SQL Server 1P and 1S. SQL Server 1P, it should have full control, and it should also have full control on 1S. SQL Server 1S. 1S. And the ID that we are going to use for configuring the Windows failover cluster is our AWS AON ID. So we don't have to grant a specific permission. If we are creating, generally in the enterprise solution, we create a different ID for clustering. So there will be another ID with AWS, for example, AWS AON-cluster. That will be a user, and that user should have permission on this computer object. But in this scenario, we are using the same ID, AWS AON, and that ID already has admin permission, so we don't have to grant any permission on this. And we also use that ID to create this object, so AWS AON is also an owner of this computer object. And after creating this object, we have to disable it. Why to disable the object? Because once we configure the cluster, this object will automatically get enabled. So if you see, AWS AON is disabled. This black arrow is symbol of disabling, and we now have four objects. We will create one more object for always on also. So once this object is created, now let's go to our SQL Server 1P and 1S, see if clustering has been installed. So clustering restart is pending, so let's restart these servers. And clustering has been installed on 1S as well, and let's restart this as this server. So when we install some software or a Windows feature, then basically the best practice is to restart the server, so all the components get installed correctly and we are able to use that feature.